Formula 1 finished its first double-header of 2025 yesterday, and it seemed that if it could happen, it happened during that Grand Prix weekend. I don't know if anybody expected it going in, but as a wise man once said, anything can happen in Formula 1, and it usually does. I think I'm going to be using that phrase a lot this year. I hope I'm not wrong. So when I woke up on Saturday morning and saw Hamilton on pole for the sprint, I thought I was looking at a parody account or I'd somehow been tricked. Because after what was going on in Melbourne, it seemed impossible that Hamilton, in only his second race for Ferrari, sort of, after that howler in Melbourne, had bagged pole position, mere hundredths in front of Verstappen. This seemed a bit of a weird one, considering everybody was expecting the two McLarens to be locking things out, and Piastri was just shy of a tenth off the Ferrari, while Lando was down in sixth. There was also the media licking their lips at a Hamilton-Verstappen front row because of the fireworks that have happened before. But with Hamilton getting the clean run into the first corner at a track where clean air is crucial, he was able to just maintain the pace and keep things going. There were reports that he backed Max up a bit during that sprint race to help nuke the front tyres, but I haven't seen any actual confirmation of that. As Verstappen's tyres inevitably died off, Piastri took second and finished just under 7 seconds behind the Ferrari. Meanwhile, it seemed that everybody was putting Norris on fraud watch TM because he'd somehow managed to finish 8th in the fastest car. Lando had an absolute howler. Now we know that the McLaren is a great car, and given his previous comments about drivers only having to beat 2 other cars in the best car, it was now a case of, alright smart ass, put that money where your mouth is, and he didn't do that. 23 seconds behind the Ferrari at the end, and 16 seconds behind his teammate, in a race that was only 19 laps long. The only logical explanation you can have for that is an absolute bungle job on the setup and the lockup he had on the first lap where he seemed to really be in the wars. Some might argue it's a pointless sprint race, but you never know what's going to happen over the course of the season. So, the feature race then. That'll be a better barometer of where things stand, right? And actually, yeah, it was. Piastri took his first ever pole position from Russell and Norris, while Verstappen slotted in behind. Max later joked in the press conference afterwards that if he wanted any chance of winning the race, he would need something to happen to the other three, because he said his car was off the pace. And in addition to this, whatever issues that Red Bull has would probably be amplified at this particular track. Had the Austrian Grand Prix been dry the whole way, Max would have been third at best because of the McLaren pace. But Oscar sliding off when the rain came had given him a freebie. Now, he'd have to contend with having Russell in front of him. And down in 20th place on the grid and then having to start from the pit lane because he changed the setup in between qualifying and the race was Max's teammate Liam Lawson. Although I'm not going to dwell on all of this too much because in my next video, which will be on Wednesday, will be more to do with the whole problems with Red Bull and the so-called curse of the second seat. There's also rumours that Tsunoda will be in that second Red Bull as early as the next Grand Prix in Japan. But since I'm here, I will quickly address that performance from Lawson. I know last season it was funny to meme Sergio Perez and to call him slow, but to have such a good end to last season in the Toro Rosso or whatever it's called now, and then be worse off in the Red Bull, it does scream fundamental issue with the Red Bull than it does issue with the driver. Because the drivers they've had in that car since Ricciardo left the team, well, they're not terrible. Okay, they're not Max's quality, but they're certainly not shit. But if you have some thoughts on that, do leave them in the comments and then I'll use them to fuel that video on Wednesday. But Norris answered his critics in the feature race with a brilliant start when the lights went out to take advantage of Russell's compromised line and then slotted in behind Piastri. Not really able to challenge for the win thanks to brake issues later on, but Oscar had the race under control from the moment the lights went out. But from there on, those three would remain there for the rest of the race. Verstappen meanwhile appeared to have a snap of oversteer at turn 1 that caused him to lose a couple of places and ended up behind the two Ferraris, while Leclerc ended up losing a front wing end plate after accidentally tagging his new teammate. And speaking of Oscar, you might be thinking, hang on a minute Aiden, don't you say that you're a Williams fan and you've got George Russell in your Twitter bio and this and this? Yes, I'm wearing an Oscar Piastri hoodie, but underneath, I am actually wearing a Williams shirt. It's almost like I've got an affiliate link with the F1 store that you can find in the description. I might as well model the gear. Although this actually came from the Castori shop in Cannock. It's a really nice hoodie, by the way. But despite the damage, Leclerc was the faster Ferrari. And it's not the first time I've seen this happen either. Mark Webber on a few occasions in his career would get a bit of front wing cracked off, a dink in a side pod, a small part of the floor taken out, and the car would somehow get faster. I hope this doesn't give Ferrari ideas though, because this is exactly the sort of thing Ferrari would try. But I'm not an aerodynamicist, so I can't tell you exactly how this would actually work. Leclerc's front wing was flapping about a bit, so maybe the left side of his front wing running lower on a track that's mostly left-handers would do something for the left-hand grip, but answers on a postcard for that one. So with Leclerc being slightly faster and running the one stop, Ferrari swapped them after those first stops, which is a legitimate strategy. If Leclerc could reach the back of Russell and get by, then that's extra points in the constructors, while Hamilton could focus on staying ahead of Verstappen. After the Grand Prix, Frédéric Vasseur said it was actually Hamilton's idea to swap the two cars, and then said he was going to go to the broadcast team and complain, because they'd made it seem like Hamilton was being iffy about letting Leclerc through. But the longer the race went on, the more the Ferraris dropped off. Leclerc lost fourth to Verstappen later in the race as a combination of tyre wear on the Ferraris and Verstappen finding some pace that allowed Max to get back in front. And with Ferrari having such a promising testing programme, they were 5th and 6th come the end of the race, with Hamilton 2 seconds away from Leclerc and looked to be closing in on Charles as the laps counted down. But behind is where there is some good stuff to mention, because Esteban Ocon, in a Haas that had been absolutely nowhere in Melbourne, came home in 7th place. Antonelli, who had been battling a damaged floor all race, came in 8th, and then the final points paying positions were Albon in 9th and Behrman in 10th. So both Haas cars made it into the points, and Albon was inside the points for the second race running. But after the race, both Ferraris were disqualified in the most Ferrari way imaginable. To have one car disqualified is a bit of a kick in the teeth. To have both cars disqualified is really going to sting. But usually when teams have both cars disqualified, they get disqualified for the same thing if it's something technical. Previous examples include BAR in 2005 with the second fuel tank, the Tyrrell cars of Brundle and Beloff in 1984 because of the lead shot debacle, the two Midland cars at the 2006 German Grand Prix for illegal flexing wings, and then the two Renaults in 2019 at Monza where they had the auto brake bias software that was illegal. But Ferrari does things slightly differently, because when it comes to ballsing it up in the most ridiculous way possible, Ferrari got both cars disqualified for 2 separate reasons. Leclerc was found to be 1 kilogram under the minimum weight limit, while Hamilton was busted for illegal wear on his skid block. Again. This happened to Lewis at the US Grand Prix a couple of years ago when he was at Mercedes. Ironically enough, at that same Grand Prix, Charles was also disqualified for the same thing. Lewis was thrown out of the results because the skid block, more commonly known as the plank, was illegally worn. And because this is a matter of technicality as per the rules that tend to be absolutely black and white as opposed to being allowed some sort of leeway as you might get with other infractions, the stewards threw out both Ferraris and the Alpine of Gasly, who was also found to be in breach of the rules regarding the minimum weight. So what is the plank, besides the guy talking to you right now? Well, I did do a piece on how it came to be in its own dedicated video just after Hamilton was last busted, as it so happens, but I'll cover it again here just briefly so you know what's what. Under the car isn't a plank of wood as such, but plastics and epoxy that just look like wood, and the FIA uses this to make sure the teams aren't taking the piss with running ride heights too low. In the ground effect era, the lower you can run the car without getting aerostall and or porpoising, the better, and if you could seal those tunnels off under the car, you get many grips. The teams will try and get the car as low as possible without scuffing this plank on bumps and curbs and so on, so that it won't wear the plank beyond acceptable margins. The FIA takes a measurement of the plank at the front and the rear, and the plank itself is only 1 centimetre thick and 30 centimetres wide. And the measurements the FIA take from it are so precise it's unreal. At the end of a Grand Prix, there must be more than 9mm of that plank thickness remaining on the car, otherwise you're disqualified. Hamilton's Ferrari, according to the race, missed the cut by 0.4 of a millimetre, so he had 8.6mm of plank remaining from the initial 10mm or 1 centimetre. So how did it end up like this? Well, changes were made to Hamilton's car following the sprint race, presumably because longer race, more fuel, more tyre management and so on. And it looks like the changes backfired. Ferrari has not and will not appeal the decision, because in these instances the rules are incredibly black and white, and usually if you try to argue mitigating circumstances, such as Schumacher when he was disqualified from the 1994 Belgian Grand Prix for the same thing, the FIA will typically say, skill issue. Okay, they won't actually say skill issue, but if your argument is I spun across a curb, or I hit something, or this, or this, or this, or this, usually the FIA will just go, well, you shouldn't have spun, you should have kept it on track, and so on. Leclerc's disqualification, on the other hand, looks to be because of a couple of reasons. It appears to be the same reason that Russell was disqualified from the Belgian Grand Prix last year, doing that brilliant one-stopper that turned out to not be so brilliant after all. It was brilliant because he won the race, but then he was disqualified, so yeah, not so brilliant after all. All of the teams had been debating whether or not to do a two-stop race and had been counting on the conditions being a little warmer than they actually were. The thing is, the track conditions were better than expected, so the vast majority of cars, Hamilton and the two Saubers being the notable if only exceptions, did a one-stopper. Leclerc, meanwhile, had been nursing that broken wing, which might have done some damage. No pun intended. So you might be thinking, oh, it was the damaged wing that made him 1 kilo underweight. But the thing is, those front wings weigh about 10 kilos, and he'd only taken the end plate off, which is way less than a tenth of the overall assembly. On top of this, after a Grand Prix, if you have damage to a part of the car that can be replaced or simply taped over, you're allowed to. So Ferrari just put a new front wing on before they weighed it. The rules regarding the weight of the car are that the car must be 800 kilograms or more, including driver and without fuel, after the race has been completed. Reports from the race said that Leclerc had initially come in at 800.5 kilos, which might get you thinking, well, that's legal. But the front wing that Ferrari had replaced the damaged one with was 200 grams heavier than the original, and then the FIA took the fuel out. When the car was reweighed with all those factors taken into account, Leclerc's Ferrari came in at 799 kilograms, 1 kilo below what is legal. The FIA takes out 2 litres of fuel when they perform these checks, and like in the aviation industry, the FIA counts fuel as mass rather than volume. Frédéric Vasseur, the Ferrari boss, said last year, "I think that Mercedes 5 years ago carried 5 kilos of fuel to be safer, but today nobody can do this kind of exercise. We are all on the edge of being disqualified every single weekend. We have to be aggressive, and it's a challenge to be at the limit of the weight, to be at the limit of the plank, to be at the limit of the cooling, to be at the limit of the fuel. It's a challenge because in the end you are taking more and more risk, and so why George was disqualified in Spa was because we are all on the edge like this." So in hindsight, maybe Ferrari should have run that two-stopper, but so many other cars ran one-stoppers that weren't caught out, so maybe Leclerc and Ferrari overdid it trying to keep pace in that damaged car. Leclerc has been on record as saying that the car wasn't necessarily faster with the damage and had become quite a handful to drive. And with it falling off to Verstappen later in the race, maybe that was the point where the tyres had lost their ability to keep up. And Pirelli has said that the C2 tyre, which is the hard tyre that got used yesterday and also a different construction to how it was last year, will lose a kilogram at maximum wear rate. I know people give the race a hard time about driver ratings and that kind of thing, but when it comes to putting the technical stuff in easy to use language, they're top notch. But it does get a little more baffling when you look at the pit stops and you see that Leclerc stopped for hard tyres 2 laps after Max and a lap after race winner Piastri. And those 2 other drivers got through the race just fine. But, as we saw at Melbourne, the McLaren is very gentle on its tyres, and even though the Red Bull is also pretty bad on its rubber like the Ferrari, the Red Bull wasn't damaged. So that's the only explanation I have for Leclerc being underweight at the end of the Grand Prix. He overdid it keeping the pace in the tyres and burned too much rubber and maybe a little bit too much fuel as well. But I'd like to know your thoughts down in the comments. But here's a fun statistic for you. Lewis Hamilton joins John Watson as a driver who has been disqualified on 3 separate occasions for 3 different teams, which is statistics that you will never get from Tomo. But what the 3 disqualified drivers do is they push other drivers up around them. As a result of the 2 Ferraris being kicked out, and this is the first time that Ferrari has ever had a double disqualification I might add, Ocon in the Haas moves up to 5th, with Antonelli moving to 6th, Albon to 7th and Behrman up to 8th. Because Gasly was also disqualified, Stroll moves up to 9th to take points for the 2nd race in a row, and Sainz, in the other Williams, scores his first points of the year. As a result of all of this, Albon has beaten his 2024 points tally already. Which means that Albon is currently 6th in the driver's standings and would be very happy if the season ended now. With the sprint races and everything else adding some points here and there, Norris leads the championship with 44 points, having a 12-point lead over Verstappen. Russell and Piastri are just behind Max, so it's very close for 2nd in the championship right now. Antonelli's a bit further back in 5th, but has otherwise had a brilliant start to the season, while Ocon is 7th, Stroll is 8th, and the 2 Ferraris 9th and 10th. But there's still 22 races to go. Don't worry, Ferrari fans, they will climb up. And because of his promotion into 10th and gaining that single point, Carlos Sainz enters a very, very, very elite club. Other than Alain Prost, he is the only driver to score points for McLaren, Ferrari, and Williams. The other thing I should probably mention, especially with these rumours that are flying about, is that Hadjar had the better of Tsunoda in his first race start. Because that's what this was. You know, he binned it on the formation lap last week. But to bounce back after that is a very mature performance, and being able to dunk on his teammate like that will give him a lot of confidence going forward. Bortoleto also beat his more experienced teammate, so the rookies are doing alright as it so happens. Lawson though, I'll cover more when I look at this second Red Bull seat curse thing. I'm sure there will be a few people in the comments making a case for Tsunoda to move up after seeing how bad Lawson was across the whole weekend. But for every one of those pro-Tsunoda comments, there will likely be a counterpoint saying that Yuki might not do much better, and it will just be a continuous revolving door of second drivers in that Red Bull. Again, Perez was memed over and over and over, and Ted Kravitz had Horner up against the ropes with a very good point. He basically said, you kicked out Perez to replace him with somebody who is doing the exact same thing. And like I mentioned earlier on, for Lawson to have had that incredible run at Austin last year in the B team car, to then make it to the A team and be completely off, screams something not right about the car rather than the driver. Perez, Albon, Gasly and now Lawson all having horrid times in that second Red Bull. And when you see that Perez was right at the top in the first few rounds of last season and then was absolutely off after Monaco, the dots start connecting. But like I say, I want to concentrate on that next time out because it's better to dedicate a whole topic to its own video. So Ferrari's elation turned to embarrassment after Hamilton secured his sprint race win. Not only was one driver disqualified for the plank infringement, the other got kicked out for being underweight. And the last time 3 or more drivers were disqualified was the Canadian Grand Prix of 2004, when both Williams and both Toyota cars were not classified because they used illegal brake ducts. Ferrari knows and admits that they got it wrong, and now they can go back to Italy, have a couple of weeks to look at the data, and then maybe try and not have a repeat of it in Suzuka next time out. And Suzuka will be an interesting race, given that you've got the figure of 8 layout, and then you've got the first section heavy on the tyres, and the spoon curve that is also heavy on the tyres. What will that do for the Red Bulls and the Ferraris in particular, who have had quite high profile tyre wear issues? I think on paper it's leading towards another McLaren domination weekend. But don't take it as a given because, well, admit it, who expected Hamilton to win the sprint? But now the doubleheader is out the way, we've just got to wait a couple of weeks to see where things go from here. I know that a lot of Tifosi had high hopes coming out of testing and seeing how good the Ferrari was compared to how it was last season, but now with Leclerc and Hamilton having all of these issues and being disqualified, it's probably putting a downer on things. But I will leave it to you to discuss down in the comments. Where does it go from here, or is it still too early to have any kind of knowledge? Like I said, let me know down in the comments and get a bit of a discussion going. So then, a look at the Chinese Grand Prix festivities and how Ferrari managed to bungle things in the most Ferrari way possible. If the things I have said today have given you some food for thought, then do give the video a like so I know I've done a good job, and for more like this from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. As ever, a big old massive thanks to the mad lads at Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help out with the picture purchasing piggy bank or otherwise keep the lights on around here, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliate links and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup or otherwise do a one and done donation, and there's memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.